I'm John Byrne with AML Rights Source. And with me today for the second time is Ashleigh Subramanian-Montgomery. She's the acting director of the Charity and Security Network, a advocacy group that works on a variety of humanitarian issues, both domestically and globally. Ashleigh, thank you so much for taking some time today. Really appreciate your willingness to give us some of your insight. Let's start with this one thing. Describe for the audience what Charity Security Network is, what their mission is, and maybe a little bit. I know you collaborate with a lot of organizations, but what are some of the other organizations that you work with on a number of issues that we're going to chat about?
Yeah, thanks so much, John, and thanks for having me back. Always great to be here with you. So Charity and Security Network, we were founded in the years after 9/11 to look at how the US's counterterrorism measures impact civil society. And civil society is really encompassing humanitarian, peace building, and human rights organizations operating all over the world. So we looked not just at the US's counterterrorism measures and impacts, but also the UN's, the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, and how all of these measures, counterterrorism measures, impede the work of civil society organizations. So as you said, we're a resource and advocacy center for nonprofit organizations, and we promote and protect their ability to carry out effective programs that support peace and human rights and aid civilians in areas of conflict or disaster and help them to build democratic governance. In terms of the organizations that we partner with, they are primarily, as I said, humanitarian, peace building, and human rights organizations. We're a membership organization, so those are a lot of our members, but we also work with academics and universities, with lawyers, with faith-based organizations, financial experts such as yourself, financial institutions, so kind of a full gamut of actors across different sectors.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the rationale for the organization to begin with, because as we've talked before and offline today, I was with the American Bankers Association on 9/11, and immediately thereafter, the industry worked very closely with our law enforcement partners to figure out what was the most efficient, most comprehensive way of dealing with an area with that had been very little focus on, and that's terrorist financing, the ability of illicit actors to get their hands on funds to commit the horrific acts of 9/11 and other acts as well. And so the thought process was to figure out transactional activity, financial footprinting, how to detect that in advance and report it. There was no conversation about potential unintended effects. Not that we wouldn't have considered them, but it was a rush, basically, a 300-page bill passed within a couple of weeks. And, you know, the banking industry was very willing to share as much information as they could. But clearly, I think it's fair to say it wasn't until working with some of your colleagues about a decade ago, when they were still grappling with the ability to get financial access and financial inclusion, that we recognized that some of that was due to the way that terrorist financing requirements, both in the US and internationally, and standards from FATF had impacted us. So we've appreciated for the past, again, I'm ballparking here, decade or so, the ability to better understand this world. And so you sitting down with us gives us even more ability to do that. Let's start with what's clearly not, there's so much has been in the news, but just recently, matter of fact, as we're recording this, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, has just issued the final, paraphrasing here, elimination of sanctions on Syria. Now, that's an area I know you have, your group is focused on. Talk a bit about both the positives of that from a humanitarian standpoint, and maybe some of the continuing challenges, if any.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. Yeah, Syria's been always fascinating to follow, but particularly in since December, really. So, I mean, the positive aspects, this really wholesale lifting of sanctions that the U.S. government did under the last executive order on Syria. General License 25 was obviously very extensive in what it authorized. So that we see both as a positive, but also as pretty unprecedented. You don't really see this level of wholesale lifting of sanctions at this rate like we saw. So that, yeah, as you noted, we see as really positive for both humanitarian work, the rebuilding, the reconstruction that needs to happen in Syria after, over a decade of civil war. We see it as also positive. A lot of times the focus is rightfully on humanitarian work, but we also like to think about peace building work and the opportunities that this wholesale lifting of sanctions will have there. Another positive impact was the lifting of the Foreign Terrorist Organization, or FTO, designation on HTS. Obviously, as you know, John, FTO designations come with such a high risk potential for criminal liability, for financial penalties if you are caught running afoul of the material support statutes. So that lifting we see is really positive. The potential lingering concerns for us, the main one is the state sponsor of terrorism, or SST designation, that's still on Syria. That we've actually heard from banking partners was more of a concern than even the FTO designation, when the FTO designation was still in place on HTS. I think when you have that type of designation, that even sometimes just the name of it can cause banks to be fearful and risk averse. So, that it's a state sponsor of terrorism, kind of this wholesale country level designation, that we see as likely to still impede the financial institution re-engagement, private sector re-engagement, which we really need, because we need the reinvestment in the country to help it rebuild. So that's one lingering concern. Obviously HTS is still designated as a specially designated global terrorist organization. Again, that's much less than an FTO designation, but it still could cause some bank hesitation, some donor hesitation, some re-engaging maybe less or slower than we would like. And then third, kind of another lingering concern, or maybe just something that I think a lot of people who are focused on how to re-engage Syria at this point, the Syrian central bank has been a black box for a really long time. So how do we both ensure that their AML CFT regulations are up to par and up to the standards that then international financial institutions will want to engage with them? But again, from the civil society and NPO perspective, ensuring they're not built out in ways that could then cause these unintended consequences or constraints on humanitarian aid down the road. And then just trying to identify the banks in Damascus that are kind of ready to function and ready to re-engage, and who are the donors in the region and internationally that are ready and willing to reinvest, and how do we make all of this work together? So especially because there's not a lot of precedent, as I said before, for this wholesale lifting of sanctions. So it's a little bit of building the plane as we fly it in Syria.
Let's stay on the sanctions topic. Obviously, our audience covers it pretty intensely. Sanctions have always been seen in part as a national security tool to try to drive requirements, to try to drive process, but always understanding that, again, you have to have some a strategy behind it. So there are sectoral sanctions. There are certainly sanctions that you hope aren't going to affect the actual economies and the citizens that really need it. There's been a lot of academic pieces that we've reported on and read in the past couple of years that have talked about the negative impact of sanctions, or do sanctions actually even work? I mean, that's also a question. How do you measure efficiency and effectiveness of sanctions from an NGO humanitarian world perspective? Now, again, understanding the premise that the sanctions are designed to go after human rights violations, Russia engaged in attacks and war against Ukraine, those sorts of things, North Korea. So the premise may be valuable, but from where you folks sit, what are some things about sanctions besides a couple that I just mentioned that our world is not aware of, and the impact, intended or otherwise? I'm curious about that because they don't all impact the same, but obviously that's an area that's getting a little more spotlight than perhaps it did a decade ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right about the level of research and data and this new evidence space that's certainly growing. So I think from where we sit, a few things I would invite listeners to check out the new Lancet report that just came out. I think the Center for Economic Policy Research also was really involved in it. And because that study on sanctions found that unilateral sanctions kill approximately 564,000 people annually, and the really striking statistic or comparison there is that really is even higher than the death toll from armed conflicts annually. So sanctions it's really a sadly strong data point that sanctions are killing more than war. So that's a study, again, I'd invite everyone to check out. I think one challenge that we see with how sanctions are used is that a lot of times governments, and I would say in particular here, the US government talks about sanctions. Obviously Treasury has been referring to them for at least the last few years since their sanctions review as a tool of first resort. But another way that they're often framed by policymakers is as an alternative to war. But I think the issue with this that we find with this framing is that because of the high death toll I just shared, economic warfare is still warfare, and it's not often framed as that, and it kind of lets, I think, policymakers off the hook, saying, "Oh, we're not invading or we're not causing conflict." But at the same time, they're not always seeing all of the consequences that do come from sanctions. So, I think, and also they're not often very targeted. So if they were, one way I think they could be more efficacious is if they were actually more targeted. There are tools that are meant to do that, like global Magnitsky sanctions. So these are tools that already exist, but usually they seem to be a lot more broad based versus targeted. I think a few other impacts. There is a lot of evidence and research that shows that sanctions do sadly impede humanitarian aid delivery and enabling aid to get to communities in need. And oftentimes sanctions are designated entities and sanctioned entities operate where there is the most need. So when that aid is cut off, then the communities who most need it aren't receiving it. And then sanctions, there's not a lot of research on this yet, but the evidence base is starting to build a little bit. But one thing that's not talked a lot about, but we try to raise, is that sanctions have really gendered impacts as well. So there are cases in North Korea, for example, where sanctions cause such economic disparity that then women are pushed into situations where, to get any kind of ability to support their family, they're pushed into precarious positions where there's sexual exploitation or abuse. In Afghanistan, sanctions contribute to there's a lot of factors in Afghanistan, obviously, but they do contribute to families selling off their girl children to be able to feed the rest of the children. Lots of health impacts, these types of things. So gendered impacts as well. And then with you on, do they have the efficacy that they say? I think that we should continue asking. And then the last thing I'll say, just there are ways that we see that sanctions could be better and more humane, and that would be, building in sunset provisions from the beginning so that they don't go on into perpetuity as we see now. As you noted, John, impact assessments that really took all of these factors into account. Are they meeting their policy objectives, but also what are the unintended consequences that you see from them?
Let's shift to unintended impacts regarding terrorist financing detection. And we've both alluded to this. FATF, when it was created back in 1989, was to deal with drug trafficking and global money laundering. And obviously, the adjustments after 9/11, they still have those priorities. They have other priorities too, but are on terrorist financing. And one of the areas of focus from your group and others has been Recommendation 8. Ask folks to take a look at that. FATF has, to their credit, recently talked about and allowed active debate, and there's been reports, and we're going to ask you to follow up on this, on the unintended impacts on NGOs and humanitarian groups with Recommendation 8. And there's been follow-up reports and things. Give us a status update on that, because I know you and your colleagues have been very, very active and very vocal about that. And FATF, it seems to me from the outside, just reading materials, that they've been willing to listen and are making attempts. You can let us know whether those attempts are bearing fruit or not. So.
Yeah. Here, I'll just shout out the Global NPO Coalition on FATF, that charity and security. We co-lead it alongside our colleagues at the Human Security Collective, a great nonprofit organization that's based in The Hague.
We've interviewed them too, by the way. We've interviewed them as well, but go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, they're wonderful. They're wonderful. We love working with them.
Yeah.
I do think FATF, I will, give them credit that I do think we've had a dialogue back and forth with them. We've been able to raise the unintended consequences and sometimes push that sometimes the consequence, they're not always unintended. There are states that do misuse and abuse Recommendation 8 for their own political expediency or gain, or sometimes even to, with better intentions, like to get off the gray list or something like that. So I do think there's a willingness, and obviously FATF undertook the unintended consequences work stream over the last few years. I would say we still think that FATF can push farther, and there's more that can be done. But appreciate their partnership and hearing us out on a lot of this. So one thing that we've been thinking about is the 5th round of mutual evaluations. Obviously, the U.S., we have our on-site early next year in 2026. I think Canada, Sri Lanka, Mexico, number of countries that the FATF coalition's been working with and looking at. So one thing we're interested in is, it's the first round of mutual evaluation since the changes to Recommendation 8 in November 2023. So interested just to see what, how these changes will actually look like in a implementation. Sorry, I'm losing my words. Will actually look like on the ground during these evaluations. The changes, just to maybe walk quickly through the changes to Recommendation 8, changes to the objective, and reiterating that the recommendation is meant to protect NPOs from terrorist financing abuse, but making, FATF made it more explicit that this has to be done without disrupting and discouraging legitimate charitable activity. So that was a good update to the objective. The scope being reframed to make it really clear that the standard applies only to a very specific subset of NPOs who meet the FATF definition of what NPOs are. And then reconnecting with risk assessment. So ensuring that the focus is on an evidence-based risk assessment and not a default that NPOs are automatically higher risk, and trying to move away from this exceptionalization of the sector that we've seen, really, like you noted, since the terrorist financing recommendations were developed right after 9/11,
Right.
ensuring that measures are focused and proportionate and also relevant to the risk. And then self-regulation. So ensuring that it's taken into account that NPOs have self-regulatory measures and that these are, part of what's being assessed. And then a few other things, just that one thing we found really positive is that the update to the best practices paper includes bad practices as well, which was kind of new. And we've actually heard it raised in other forums that this is a good model that we hope, other types of updates or papers can adopt. And then, yeah, that's kind of all of the updates for recommendation 8 and how we, are envisioning or thinking they'll be implemented in the next round of mutual valuations. The other thing I want to talk about, John, is just the new procedure that FATF just adopted to address unintended consequences affecting nonprofit organizations. So on the one hand, this represents progress because for a long time, the FATF coalition, had asked FATF that there needs to be a way to raise issues that were happening in the name of FATF standards and recommendations outside of just a mutual evaluation process. And this does create that opportunity. But we also see some challenges with it. So for this mechanism to be triggered, sorry, should I maybe talk about what the mechanism is?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So essentially, this is where it's an ability to bring any kind of issues that you're seeing that a country is weaponizing FATF standards or misuse of the FATF standards, essentially. So when this trigger mechanism was initially being looked at, it did include a wider variety of actors that could trigger the mechanism. So, for instance, UN special procedures, meaning UN special rapporteurs, academics. These were all actors that were going to potentially be included. Unfortunately, this was shut down. So the group that can trigger the mechanism is pretty constrained. It's really just 2 or more FATF or FSRB, FATF-style regional body members, or the IMF or the World Bank that can bring an unintended consequences report forward, essentially. So I think it's a little bit hard to imagine how this will work in practice, given those are the actors. We would have, liked to see this be open for public consultation. Obviously would have liked to see NPOs be an actor that could trigger the mechanism. So we're thinking through, are there ways, given that this is now final, to make the whole process less exceptional so that states aren't, don't never trigger it or feel like it's punitive in how it operates.
What was the rationale for not including you folks in the process? It must have been discussed at some point. What was the arguable rationale for that?
Yeah, I think from what we heard, it was in the plenary discussions where these conversations, in the FATF plenary discussions where these conversations were unfolding. It was hard to get it through baseline, so it kind of had to keep being watered down and drilled back on the actors in order for it to get passed. There is a review process, so it has to be reviewed every either 3 or 5 years. So there will be, I guess, an opportunity at that point. But the thinking now is that we need a really, really solid test case to bring forward to show that it does have efficacy and can work. Otherwise, it might just be kind of touted as not a good mechanism. So
it's going to be interesting to see if private sector groups can reach out to, for example, the World Bank and say, you need to go, you need to be part of this process and have them tell you why they can't, or the regional bodies. So, I mean, I know that. That's part of what you folks will do during the 3 to 5 year period. Before I let you go, because I am going to ask you about all the severe cuts in the U.S. to foreign aid. But I do want to talk a little bit about the executive order that was issued a couple of weeks ago on, I'm paraphrasing, fair banking or some
Right.
description. And you and I have talked about this. One of the very real issues in the de-risking issue that banks face all the time, making a risk-based decision on whether they onboard an account or they exit a relationship based on risk, is that because of what we talked about at the beginning, that humanitarian groups were unfairly cast under the same umbrella, like no matter where they existed, that all charities were a tad suspect because of what happened on 9/11, that we had to, over time, put some reports together, some advocacy. We were able to get the banking agencies in the U.S. at least to pay lip service to the fact that not all charities are the same in their guidance statements. I'm not being pejorative. They did do that, and obviously that's still something that, well, we all are challenged with. But this order isn't focused on those activities.
Right.
I actually have the order in front of me because I referenced this at a conference I moderated last week. It says that, I'm reading from part of it here, financial institutions have engaged in unacceptable practices to restrict law-abiding individuals and businesses access to financial services on the basis of political or religious beliefs or lawful business activities. I won't read more because I'll laugh out loud too much. But another line in this, I guess I will say, they said bank regulators have used supervisory scrutiny and other influence over regulated banks to direct or otherwise encourage politicized or unlawful debanking activities. None of that's true, by the way. In fact, the reason I pulled that out during the conference last week, a Reuters piece recently found that the CFPB, in the 13 years that they existed, had only 35 complaints over 13 years of entities being arguably discriminated against. Now, your world has many more examples of issues where the banks have said, we don't know how to mitigate the risk because we're not sure, that sort of thing.
Right.
What's your general take about this order versus, my words, not yours, the real need to address why de-risking needs to deal with unintended effects?
Yeah, this order, it is really something. I mean, first of all, it's an interesting departure, political departure from the previous, from the Biden administration, because they were really adamant that the U.S. government cannot tell banks what to do. So this is obviously a real change from that. But yeah, I mean, just thinking about who they point to as being debanked, conservative organizations, Christian religious groups,
gun dealers, yeah,
gun dealers, cryptocurrency folks. From our perspective, we've been tracking and documenting how debanking really impacts the NPO sector very, very heavily. And when you think about religious targeting for debanking, the most obvious group that comes to mind for me in the US context is Muslim groups, Muslim-led organizations, Muslim communities. There's a great report that ISPU put out called Banking While Muslim. There's a lot of, there is a strong evidence base for this, unlike, I think, a lot of the claims in the executive order. Women-led organizations face similar issues with debanking. I think also when you think about how the EO talks about debanking practices weaponize a politicized regulatory state, if you talk to organizations who either operate in or provide services to areas like Syria, Palestine, Somalia, they'll tell you that the regulatory state has always been politicized. So this isn't, anything new or something that's just happening because Trump says it's happening. And obviously it was a very personal EO, since he talked about how he himself had recently been debanked by two banks, which, I think we could question whether the highest leader of a country should be putting out policy directives based on kind of their personal feelings or experiences. But Yeah, I think it's, I mean, some of the language we're wondering, can we pick up on this and use positively, like the risk-based analysis and
Right.
approach? This is, something that FATF requires you to do and that we don't always see banks doing. So, is there some kind of odd bedfellows way we can
Right.
promote civil society through this? I don't know, because obviously, it's not meant to support civil society or NPOs, but it has something that it is something, debanking is something we've been talking about and tracking for a really long time.
It's interesting. I hate the term because I think it should be de-risking because the decision making
Same.
is based on that. No, I realize that. Um, what's going to be really fascinating is during this evaluation of the U.S. by FATF, how are they going to discuss this executive order? And also, I'm aware, at least in Florida, I think there's another state that passed a
Hmm.
law in the past year that allows fines against institutions that don't bank gun dealers and some other categories. Now, I'm not sure how the process works. I know some bankers that have their institutions there, and they've said there's been no cases brought yet. So it's going to be interesting, as you mentioned about something else. Interesting when a case is brought. What are the facts of that case? So that's going to be
Mhm.
fascinating. But to your larger point, that's right. Telling banks what they must do. I spent many years with the American Bankers Association, and one of our not tagline, but one of our major responses to mandated anything was banks are not a utility. They have to feel
Mm.
free to bank who they want to bank without discriminating. So you can't
Right.
discriminate, but because there's obviously equal credit laws and all those fair lending and all those Community Reinvestment Act, all those things are important. But at the end of the day, you weren't told you must deal with this particular institution. So that's going to be a fascinating uh, thing to watch. So we'll all be interested from different angles, of course. So
Right.
we'll see about that. I'm going to get you out of here on this. There was a lot more I'd like to talk to you about, and maybe we could do a follow up in a few months with you and your colleagues. But the last thing, just given all of the cuts in U.S. aid, USAID, but just in general foreign aid, this administration obviously is not interested in what people have called soft power, to be able to provide
Right.
help. And I know there are many, many jurisdictions where we probably are not hearing what are the real time impacts. I mean, we know what's happening in Gaza and Sudan and other places, but I'm sure you're much more aware than we are. Give us a sense of scope of what these policy changes have meant. And I don't want to end on a super negative note, but then maybe you can give us what are your hopes going forward in the next couple of years? First, talk about what the real issues that are going on today, the lack of aid, which is horrific. It's a clear policy decision not to work outside the U.S. But what in your world, what are you and your colleagues hopeful about going forward?
Yeah, I think it's really, I'm happy to close on the hope piece because I think it's
Yeah,
important to stay rooted in that in these
right.
times. So I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah, I mean, the aid cuts are just so devastating. So some of the most severe impacts, it's exacerbating extreme hunger and malnutrition. And this is in places like you just mentioned, John, like Gaza, where, famine is already unfolding. And I know
Yeah.
the IPC report just came out, but there's a lot of folks who thought it's been happening a lot longer than just recently as well. It's also creating a decline and worsening of health systems, maternal health, basic access to medicines and to care, and things like this are being really, really impacted. It thwarts the ability to alleviate poverty, which, obviously one of the core goals of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and other global agendas. It'll negatively impact that as well. Creating more climate vulnerability, and a lot of times, sadly, the highest levels of climate vulnerability often are already happening where there's a lot of disaster related risks or other vulnerabilities that are already happening. So it'll continue to increase those. Areas of conflict and violence. I think, if there was funding for peace building or just ability to engage with different actors to a conflict, that there's not any more dialogue programs, these types of things, that will sadly get worse. There's been a lot that has also been really, a lot of the impacts really disproportionately are impacting women and girls in particular, which we see, again, it's kind of always the most vulnerable or the most marginalized that then get hit the most when a disaster or an aid cut or whatever conflict, whatever it might be, happens. And then just basic access challenges. So, where you might have been able to have enough funds or personnel power or even things, like compliance staff in place. Now, if you don't have those, how are you going to physically get aid in? So I think those are a lot of the impacts. In terms of hopes going forward, I think one of the things that we're really hopeful for, and some donors have been really great about this already, others could be doing more. I think, we're really hopeful that donors will truly understand the level of dire situation that the nonprofit sector in the US and globally is facing, and that if they don't fund us now, there might not be a sector left to fund. So I think we're seeing a trend that donors are starting to understand this more and are, starting to say, how much can we spend down? Because it really is, if we don't do it now, we might not have an opportunity to do it. So hopeful that trend will continue. And other positive trends from donors like trust-based philanthropy and these types of approaches that I think just enable civil society and NPOs to do their work better. That's one thing I'm seeing as a hopeful point. Another thing is just really the NPO and civil society sector, but also other sectors come together and rally together in solidarity and support in this time. We've been on lots of calls or conferences or forums where there's really been this emphasis on, because we know there's a lot of disinformation campaigns and lawfare attacks and politically motivated attacks, where it's really, if one of us comes under attack, we all need to act like it is our organization coming under attack and rally and mobilize and support that organization. So there's really been a lot of solidarity and coming together of the sector. And then maybe the final point of hope is that we're seeing different parts of the sector that aren't traditionally aligned, not that they're opposed, but just not working together, coming together. So we're seeing, a lot of what is being, a lot of the legislation that's targeting charities, maybe it's impacting immigration groups and we haven't traditionally engaged them. How do we bring them into the fold? How do we bring, reproductive rights groups into the fold? How do we make sure LGBTQ groups are supported? So I think there's a lot of, within the nonprofit sector, kind of cross-sectoral energy and working together that we haven't traditionally seen. So all of that is giving me hope.
Well, that's good. You folks have to keep doing what you're doing. The Charity and Security Network, you can find them online. They also issue a newsletter, which has excellent updates on some of the things we've already talked about. Ashleigh, thank you so much for the time today. More importantly, thank you for what you and your folks are doing. We're to keep it going, and our folks in the AML community are with you. And we just got to keep reminding people about some of the unintended as well as intended impacts of policy and other changes. And as you say, you go after one, you go after all, sort of like the NATO concept for the humanitarian world, which makes a ton of sense. Thank you for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, John.
Stay safe. See ya.
You too.